Hello, welcome to our Bible class. I'm Jovan. I am one of the preachers here for the Highland Church of Christ, and we're thankful that you're here with us today. I'm thankful that we're able to study the Bible together online, and hope that our study and our brief walkthrough on the book of Acts, especially as it focuses on the efforts of the Apostle Paul, have continued to be encouraging to you, in hopes that it'll help you appreciate the message of Acts and the labors of the Apostle Paul. We're going to get into our study today, and we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 17, verses 16 to 34. And one of the things that we will see is Paul go into the famous city of Athens. So there is much to look at today. It's a jam-packed text. We will not get through all the things that could be said about Paul being in Athens. We never can in these studies. But I hope that what we do point out will be a benefit to you in illuminating the text, understanding Paul's work, and getting a sense for the nature of the sharing of the gospel in a setting that is a bit different from other settings he's been in. It almost is a heightened event like in Lystra, where he is going to preach, not focused on Scripture, though that will be the background to what he says, but he will appeal to the Athenians using philosophy, art, and make them illustrations of a biblical worldview. So we're going to get into our text today and see Paul in Athens, Acts 17, verse 16 to 34. Okay, so as we look at Acts 17, and we see how the gospel is moving along, Paul is moving further through the Greek world, beginning as he came over because of a vision in Acts 16 to go into Macedonia, the province of Rome, which includes the ancient Greek world. And Paul continues to go through this. In fact, it will be regions known as Macedonia and Achaia, and this is part of that entire trip. And so the gospel makes it to Athens. Now, what's significant, of course, about Athens is the home of philosophy, the home of great thinkers, the home of speculation philosophy. It's all sorts of things that really we are heirs to. We do a lot of thinking of similar lines, and so he is going into the heart of Greek thinking, Greek culture, and it will be this heritage, in fact, that Alexander the Great himself would have learned from back in the 4th century BC, and it was his teacher Aristotle, and it was his father Philip II, or Philip of Macedon, who embraced the Greek culture and embraced and adapted military strategy from the Greek culture, and then trained Alexander to become what we would now refer to as Alexander the Great. And it would be this sort of shared heritage that begins in this Greek world, that is now spread all across the Mediterranean world, and now has become the common culture in a sense, at least in terms of language and sort of the crossing of culture, as Alexander sort of implanted Greek culture, civilization, language, all those key elements to maintain a culture. And as these new people are conquered, we also then hear and see a development of their own version of what it means to be of this sort of linguistic heritage, this culture, this growing horizon where where the culture of Greece is now embraced by all. And that's not to say that everyone was a Greek. It's just to say the influence now has trickled down. And now the gospel, which has now been given a universal language, not the language of Aramaic of Palestine, but Greek of the first century, what we have called Koine Greek, Common Greek. What I like to say, the Greek of non-native Greek, which becomes their native language, or one of them. And now he is returning, so to speak, with a gospel of victory, a different kind of victory than that of Alexander, a victory over death, a victory over injustice, and we'll see that as this picks up. But let's get into the text. We have a lot to cover, so we're not going to do what we've done before, read the whole section of our reading. So let's just get into, and we'll break it up piece by piece. So keep your Bibles open. It says here in Acts 17:15, those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. This is simply a setup verse. It sets up the narrative, the transition from Paul's work in Berea, Paul's work in Thessalonica, and as Paul is going to do some work now in Athens and sharing the gospel. And the trip probably, it's hard to tell for sure how long the trip was, but maybe around a week or two. This is now the city, the ancient city in the midst of the new city of Athens, modern Athens. You can see how much space the ruins of the marketplace, the ancient marketplace, the Parthenon, and we'll look a little bit to that. You see some of the other structures, and you see the mountain ranges, but you see how the new city has grown up around the old city, and as much as possible keep that old city intact, or parts of it at least. This is a little close up. We see a temple, foreground, and the marketplace. Just a couple snapshots. I don't have a lot to say about this until we get down a little later. And I had an opportunity to go to the Nashville replica of the Parthenon in Nashville, full scale. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But here are just a few snapshots by the Faith Life Bible Study Bible book. So there's a few pictures from that resource. Now this will be where Paul actually stood. This is where Paul will make his defense in the speech from Acts chapter 17. This is also sometimes called Mars Hill, but we'll talk about that also. Here is one of the temples, the temple you saw earlier, the temple to the god of fire, Hephaestus. In the Roman religion, he becomes Vulcan. So yes, Spock is Vulcan, no relation whatsoever. But nevertheless, we see that. My point in showing this is to point out how there was a lot of gods, and each had some sort of shrine or maybe a temple like this. Not all of them had large scale. Many of them had just simple, modest ones. But here in Athens, they go big. I guess they're like Texas. Everything goes big there. Just to get a sense of the travel, Paul leaves Berea by sea. And that's the idea of him being conducted. It's a nautical term. And he makes it to Athens. And then he'll make it to Corinth. And as he gets through, and you see how he goes from the province of Macedonia to Achaia. And we'll see how that goes. But back to our text. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace or business center every day with those who happened to be there. I don't have any evidence of the synagogue of the first century to add to my slides here, but this is part of Paul's labor, and there is evidence that the Jews had synagogues scattered throughout the first century world, and as the Jews began to migrate away from Jerusalem, away from their homeland, they set up these synagogues, and so there is a lot of reason to believe that there was a synagogue there, and that they had developed a following of devout persons. This is another term to describe non-Jewish people who are interested in the God of Israel, the God of creation. They have become devout persons, religious people. It is a significant term. So the group of Jews in the synagogues, or at least here in Athens, the synagogue of Athens, had developed a following outside of the Jewish people, which seemed to be pretty common. So definitely the religion of Israel is winsome. There's something to it that others want to know about. And so you sort of get a sense of all the things that Paul is dealing with. He's going to the Jewish synagogue. He is speaking there. He is engaging them. He's in the marketplace. And there's partly a reason for being in the marketplace. And it has to do with, as it says here, where things happened. This is where things happened. This is where the people were. And among them will be a group of philosophers, and we'll get to in just a moment. Few slides to illustrate the many gods. This is just part of just sort of the area, the archaeology of the area that it's visible. You can see as you're walking. It is simply filled, I guess would be a good word to sort of go along with what Luke says. The city was full of idols, and so all of these figures are molded deities of the gods of the Greeks, and then who the Romans would later name with their own names, and so you couldn't get around Athens without something devoted to a god, something named by a god or for a god, or some sort of event in mythology. And the same is true even with the Parthenon. Again, the marketplace. This is where you probably go shopping or something. So it was in a place like that, right? In a place like this, that he runs into these particular philosophers, the Epicureans and the Stoics. We'll talk a little bit about them. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" And so they're kind of talking bad about him. Others said he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. Now, the concept of resurrection is not a new concept in religion. The concept of dying and rising from the dead is not, or going down to the realm of the dead and coming back. In fact, that description is not uncommon at all in Greek mythology. And so, but the attachment to a person, normal person, so to speak, who goes to the realm of the dead and returns, he resurrects, he rises up again. He does what Jesus does. Now that is a combination of concepts that would stand out to be different and demand a bit of attention, and created certainly a reason to ask what's going on. But the way that he is described, at least in the first quote, is derogatory. What does this babbler, one who collects scraps, right? It's like, if you think about it, preaching sometimes feels like you're taking concepts, from different parts of the Bible, even though there is a continuity there. even though there is something to be said between that connects all of them. If you view the Bible being the word of one mind, God, then all of it is from God, and there's something to be said in those stories that have meaning, and sometimes they might be separated. But we're not too sure exactly his argument until we get to a big speech by Paul. But certainly, I can understand personally how, from an outsider's point of view, it might feel like it's just these random pieces of things happening that he's talking about. Like, what is going on here? So, nevertheless, and I'm not saying that Paul was, not being intelligent, but from an outsider's point of view, it probably felt that he is connecting different pieces of a puzzle that they don't even know what the picture is, and so because they come from different perspectives. So I think that becomes sort of the lightning rod to explain why Paul goes into sort of the preaching mode that he does, pulling from natural theology, pulling from all sorts of things. So we'll look at that. So, but who are the Epicureans and the Stoics? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I just want to introduce you because if you're the average Bible reader, you probably don't spend a lot of time in Greek philosophy or ancient Greek philosophy. But the Epicureans were named after an Athenian named Epicurus, and he, about 306 BC, just a few years after the establishment of Thessalonica, by the way, 316, by Cassander, brother-in-law to Alexander the Great. But Epicurus sort of founds the school. We'll put that in quotes. Essentially, they were deists. They believed that the gods were utterly indifferent to humanity. In other words, they exist, but they're not really. They don't have a strong commitment to the human experience, except what's connected to their desires, passions, or wars. Right. So we just live here, kind of like the way ants live in the wake of us, just walking through the ground. Right. They viewed the world materialistically. There was an ancient view of evolution, some sort of progress, some sort of connection there. And then Epicureanism also played out with the concept of pleasure, physical pleasure. So sexuality was a big deal. Freedom from care. So if things were, troubling you, you tried to embrace learning how to, not care. Connections, relationships. You learned to not be worried, and it's not an unheard of concept. Jesus talks about being, don't be anxious over tomorrow. Today there's sufficient evil for today. Don't worry about what you will eat, what you will wear, right? But it's grounded in trusting who God is. This is grounded in you can't change anything. The Stoics, on the other hand, have are named after sort of the location of where they talk and they study or they do philosophy. Founded by Zeno, the Stoic, because he would use a stoa or a porch. They are sort of the covered areas of various buildings of Greece, and that's where he would do his teaching, and that's where he would lecture, sometimes like in the Agora, which is the marketplace. In this sense, his view of the deities were more pantheistic. In other words, the gods are everything. Everything is an extension of the gods in nature. There's no direct distinction, or there's no cutoff point between what nature is and what the divine is. So he appeals to that sort of concept. Pantheism is not an extinct philosophy, and as late as Albert Einstein, who believed in a God much like that. At any rate, what we see in their philosophy was that fate ruled all things, including the divine. In other words, it's sort of a fatalism. It's just going to be. Que sera, sera. Right? It's just going to be. You have to just learn to accept change. So the end result had a lot of similarity with the Epicureans. The process, the sort of tenets of it are somewhat different, but in essence, I think they stack up together to show sort of the view of the gods. Either the gods are everything and everything around us, and like absolute reason, and even if they do exist, they're probably not really concerned with us. They're busy with other things. They do not have sort of like a covenantal relationship the way we read in the Bible. God having a covenantal responsibility to creation and us to Him. This is a porch. This is sort of a column building. You can see the sort of space that you can use to have these sort of conversations, these lectures, and discussions. So just to give this is just to illustrate the idea of a stoa. All right. So these two groups, they give audience to Paul, and this is going to be the people that Paul ends up speaking to, and he ends up going. Notice how it says, and they took him. There doesn't seem to be necessarily a lot of negativity there. It's possible, but he goes to the Areopagus, the hill of Ares, or Mars Hill, the war god, and that's a location, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it's an important location for things like this. So when they bring him, they ask him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting?" Because remember, they said he must be talking about some of the gods. "For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. All right, so it's a unique opportunity. It's a unique opportunity, which I have to admit is a pretty impressive thing. It's a pretty impressive thing by the Athenians, by the Epicureans, by the Stoics, to be willing to say, "Hey, this guy who is kind of new to town, he's sharing something. He's talking about resurrection. He's talking about different gods that we haven't heard of, and what exactly is it, and what does it mean? What does it mean that you believe in Jesus of Nazareth, who died, was buried, and rose again? What does that mean?" And I love that attitude, because it's not just an opportunity to leverage to share this gospel message, but it shows a great attitude. It shows a great attitude. It's very different from the controversial environments of Paul in the synagogue. It's not necessarily adversarial. It is inquisitive, and it's at least an opportunity to know, what does this mean. And after all, I mean, Paul is having conversations. We don't know how long these conversations happened in the marketplace with individuals like this, but it was enough to create some sort of interest, and perhaps they would ban him, or they would at least acknowledge that they heard something new that would be worth reconsidering, right? Something like that. So the Areopagus speech, because he's on the hill of Ares, or Mars Hill. As I said, this is an aerial view of it. It's just overlooking the sort of area of old Athens, and a couple quick points. As I said before, it's the court of Ares Hill, and in old times it was a place of sort of political, judicial matters at the Supreme Court of Athens. But by Paul's time, it apparently, based on my resources, had to do with interest in religion, and an interesting opposite extreme, homicide issues. So maybe it's just more of an inquisitional place, like what are you teaching, or who did this and why did it happen, that sort of thing. And it is one of the certain places in biblical history that's been identified with certainty, and you can still walk up there under the same steps that he did. So Paul begins his speech by being in the Areopagus, and this is what he says: "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found an altar with this inscription: to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. And again, I apologize for breaking up our looking at the text, but there's a lot of meat here, and that's why I really want to get into some of this itself. Now, as I had pointed out before, there were lots of gods everywhere. Uh, Structures had gods carved into them, temples certainly. So the gods are everywhere. There is nothing clearer about Greek and Roman religion is that except that they were pluralistic and they had many gods, and their mythology of these gods. Each god had sort of a responsibility or a power over the natural world, and each of them reflects this. And then at times they war amongst each other for dominance and power, and all sorts. Sometimes they work together against evil forces, all sorts of stuff. And some of the other stories are when they come in, just they play and toy with the human beings, like Zeus, and his many exploits with women. Some of them pretty horrendous. Regarding this altar, now the Athenian altar has not been found that has to the unknown gods, but throughout ancient history, altars like this have been found throughout. And I have a couple authors here. Pausanias, he's from the late 2nd century. He has in his book Descriptions of Greece discussed that situation. Diogenes Laertius, also 2nd, 3rd century. These altars did exist, and in Pergamum and in Rome, there are inscriptions, and there's a Latin one that sits in the museum in Rome, found in 1820, with an inscription in Latin, and this is the one right here, to their gods or goddesses, sort of a generic offering and acknowledgement. Now, so Paul is saying he's using this opportunity of this unknown God, right? This agnosto theo, this God that we don't know, right? We're not sure of who they are. Some God out there, right? And that is sort of a demonstration, that they were open to other deities that might emerge on the scene, that their pantheon of divinity wasn't closed. There was canonical deities, but their canon wasn't closed per se, and so they left things open. So it's almost like covering your bases. You have a dinner party, and you might want to make sure you don't miss anyone, so you add an extra seat or two. Make sure that in case an extra person comes, they have a place to sit. Well, this altar is just one of those kind of seats, right? So he says, let me tell you about this God that you don't know, this God that you're unaware of, the God who, back to verse 23, versus the what, right? This personal concept versus an impersonal concept. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. So we are introduced to sort of a Genesis argument, a Genesis chapter 1 argument, or an Exodus 20 verse 11 argument. For in 6 days the Lord created everything and all that is in them, and it might be interesting to point out that, on the surface, it's kind of interesting for a man who's speaking about God who does not live in temples made by man, since God of Israel did have a temple. But God always made it very clear that's where he would dwell for Israel to acknowledge his presence. But he was the God of everything, everywhere. Right? There's nothing hidden from him. He may have been the God of Israel, but he was the creator of all things. So it reinforces Israelites' theology of being unique and having a unique relationship. But it was not proof that God had to dwell there. And many times, even in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, the prophets, God says, "I will leave the temple." Right? So um, he doesn't need the temple to exist. He doesn't need the temple to be honored. Yeah, that's an important part. Still, for the Athenians, for this culture, it seems that that's an important point. That the God who created heavens and the earth does not need a temple. He doesn't need to be served as if he needed anything. And so he's the one in turn who gives life. We don't give the God's life. God gives us life. So we spin around the theology here, and Paul is making that argument. Like we may serve our God and it's connected to a temple, but it's not because he needs us. It's about a bigger relationship than just needing servants. At any rate, he goes, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. I'll keep moving on. I'll come back to something here. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. All right. So, verse 26 and 27 now point to, again, a Genesis argument. Though he's not citing Genesis, he is making a Genesis argument. He is making a biblical argument, but he's doing it in such a way where he's summarizing so that those who don't have a Bible can understand a biblical worldview. He made from one man. Now, the New King James has an additional word there. To be fair, it comes from just one word, henos. So sometimes when you're translating, you understand to imply a person. Right? The New King James, in the text that it's based on, includes a word, haematos. Haematos, which is the Greek word for blood. Hematology, we have studies of that. But here Paul is making, he made from one man. If you read the New King James, it'll say he made from one blood. There is a textual variant here. And all the textual variant is that in the transcription of the text, sometimes words are added or omitted. Usually they are self-corrected in the margins of these manuscripts, like they're aware that something has been omitted or something. So biblical scholars have spent a lot of time trying to ascertain the original language of the text. And anyone who deals with ancient documents has to do that, since everything was done by hand. Thus you have a manuscript. Manu coming from the Latin word for man, hand. So, at any rate, the net effect of the argument is the same. God made through one man or one blood everything you see around. In other words, we're all connected. This might be a shot against, in either way you look at it, it might be a shot against the Athenians or the Greek culture that sort of felt it was separate and apart from the rest of the world, that they are the true human, they are the true native of the world, and therefore, everyone else is, unfortunate that they're not Greeks, right? Well, Paul is saying, from a biblical argument, God made from one person. Let's just use the one here, right? He made from one every nation of mankind. Right? So the argument is God made from one all. God made from one every. That's the essential argument here. Now, if you want to introduce the blood argument, well, believe it or not, for quite some time, we human beings didn't realize that humans share blood. There are blood types, but different races did not have different blood. Humans, we thought for quite some time that just because you were a different race, the blood was not compatible, but that's been disproven over and over and over. We don't even think about it or talk about it. But we share the same, we have the same biological system, regardless of skin tone, regardless of gender, regardless of native lands. So there is truth to the idea of one blood. But is that the nature of the original text? I'm inclined to say no. What Paul is saying here is he made from one person every nation of people, and I think that's the broader argument here. He made from one human every nation of humans to live on all the face of the earth, and this is God doing it. Okay, God is in charge of that they should live on the face of the earth. He made them so that they would, and he would determine their allotted periods. And God is the one who places their boundaries or their dwelling place, that they should seek God. There's a purpose to this, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way or grope their way toward him and find him. Verse 26 and 27, therefore, have a lot to say to us today in light of racism and in light of all kinds of racial problems and tensions. From a biblical point of view, we need to realize that we're all connected. We're all together in this. This human experience is all of ours. God made from one Adam and Eve, right? From one, every human. That we're all connected. And even though God may have selected Israel or Abraham and then Israel after him and his descendants, he is still God of everyone. He had intended that his management of the earth and all its different nations and his involvement having determined their allotted periods and their boundaries, that it would sort of create a tension, that they would seek after him, that they would grow. And quite possibly, Paul is saying here, the various deities that you have carved out and created is an example of you groping your way toward God, toward the true God. In other words, what you see in nature that implies to you a spiritual world, that you have now developed a sophisticated mythology with deities that are superhuman, actually is an argument that you see the evidence of nature that it points to a divine essence, a divine realm. But you have not had enough revelation to shape that accurately. I think that's what he's saying here. And I think it can be said from a biblical point of view that that's what many of the religions around the world are like. It's a groping after God. It's a demonstration that they know there's something beyond what they see. There's something beyond the naturalism of our world. And it's something to explore. And now he has an opportunity to say, so let me connect my dots with your dots and see how this plays out. And then he quotes playwrights, philosophers, Epimenides and Aratus. These are the two that are often cited as sources for these quotes. There's at least a small speculation on one of them. But at any rate, he's quoting material that they would acknowledge. He is actually not far from each one of us. In him we live and move and have our being. So they would have acknowledged, they would have got the reference to that. It would be like Paul quoting, maybe a Star Wars quote. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. And this is what we see him doing also. For we are indeed his offspring. Another philosopher, Stoic philosopher, which I found interesting. So the Stoics would have indeed accepted and appreciated his knowledge of them. And maybe he picked up on this through conversations in the marketplace. Or perhaps since he was from Tarsus, maybe he knew a few things about Greek culture already. But again, the net effect here is he's making the point: we're all God's offspring, all of us. Your people acknowledge that. My people acknowledge that. So we see from nature a theological worldview. But your worldview is so open, you have an unknown God that you don't know about. And this is the one I want to connect the dots to. Because when you connect the dots to this God, you'll realize there are no other gods. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. And now Paul transitions to a message with some bite. As the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. So now Paul connects the arguments of the resurrection of Jesus. And what we see there is, now this God who created everything, this God that you acknowledge potentially exists, and this God that has been with you all this time, that you've been groping after, the connection here is the times of ignorance, this groping after God. God is overlooked. He sort of understands the situation, and he'll deal with that accordingly. But now, those two words right there, but now, a huge shift is happening. He commands all people everywhere to repent. And the word repent is an important theological term about knowing to have a change of heart, which leads to a change of action. It is change of concept. It is learning to experience letting go of the past and embracing something new. And this is what needs to happen. This is what repentance is all about. It's always about a change of mind, and how that change of mind leads to an actual change of action and living. And that is part of what the gospel is about, giving people perspective enough to know how to change their mind, to change the way they think about things, morality, religion, treating each other, the earth, etc. Because he has fixed a day. So now the rationale. He has fixed a day and he will judge the world in righteousness. So the mundos, the world around him, around Athens, Rome, the world in the Mediterranean world, North Africa, Egypt, down to Madagascar. And even for us today, we think about all what the world is, wherever human beings are. He will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And why does this man get to be appointed? Because he was risen from the dead. Again, the Christian message of resurrection has application to behavior, because it is through the resurrection of Jesus that gives Jesus the right. It is the demonstration that Jesus is exactly the one who can do this. Because he rises from the dead, that gives him the authority or the platform or the demonstration that he is exactly who he claims to be. Exactly who God claims him to be. Exactly who Paul claims him to be. Or any New Testament writer. The Son of God, deity in the flesh, and he is coming back. So the reaction was 50-50. I don't know that we would ever expect anything different. But now when they heard the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." So Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed. That means they obeyed the gospel, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So we see some Greeks, maybe devout people, but certainly people that were in the crowd and perhaps had been a part of the conversation this whole time. So the church in Athens is growing. And that's pretty much where the text ends. The church in Athens is growing. Is there a Christian presence there today? I believe so. And that's always a fascinating thing to know. Now, before we close, I just want to do a quick walkthrough of the Parthenon in Nashville. I'm not going to show you everything that I did, but this is a full-scale replica of the Parthenon in Athens, but this one is in Nashville. So if you want to take a cheaper trip, you can go to the one in Nashville. You can see that above it, there is massive depictions of the gods. This is a depiction of a contest between Athena. She's on the right, on the top of the pyramid. She's on the right. She has a shield in her hand and a spear, and Poseidon is sitting in a chair right to her left. And this is a contest where Athena will win. Nike will crown her with victory. When you walk in, you see a small scale on the left version of the 41-foot and 10-inch replica of what would have been in the Parthenon in Athens. And you see in the statue on the left, you'll see Nike, the god of victory, in her hand. She's crowned. She is ready for war. She has a shield. She has her python. These are elements of her power, and so she is pretty. She's pretty well represented here. Now, one thing about this is a replica. There is no known statue that has survived. So this is potentially not exactly what the ancient one looked like, but this is based on a lot of research, and so it's an approximate. At any rate, there's some interesting things to look at. Athena has a shield, and in the shield on the outside of the shield, the one on the left with that little face, you see a lot of depiction of war and sort of crisis and struggle. And the same is true on the inside, on the far left. And this again is to demonstrate that Athena is a god of war. She is in Athens, despite being a philosophically grounded community, has heritage to the gods of war, and that becomes an important thing that acknowledges Athena and therefore acknowledges Athens, that's named after her. At her feet is again a series of gods, sort of acknowledging this and acknowledging this event and this elevation of Athena. So I'm moving you from left to right. This is the center of the picture, right under her feet, and then again, these are various gods attributing honor to her. So I know this is a fast walkthrough, but there's just so much going on in this speech. And I guess the most important part I want to bring up is when Paul goes into Athens, he's not intimidated by philosophy. He's not intimidated by Greek thinking or Greek religion. And the reason being is because all religions, from a biblical point of view, all religions are groping after God. It is a human sense to, sometimes it's called the religious nature of man. The religious nature of man is a groping after God. It's a sense that we're not alone. And it's a sense that there's something beyond the natural world. And it is this sort of sense and knowledge that is important to acknowledge without over critiquing it, without over, we're overly treating it as a negative thing. Paul treats it as a positive and says, this leads you to chase after God. And now I'm going to tell you about the God you don't know. And perhaps if we learn to take a more calmer approach, and even if people won't believe what we're saying, if we just say, look, I think what you are believing is not far off the beaten path of where I'm at. And let me tell you how I got to where I'm at if you're interested. And I'm concerned because God has said one day all injustices will be handled. All things that are contrary to his will will be addressed in justice through Jesus Christ. And so it's important for us to rethink what we're doing, repentance, and therefore have a change of action, and then to believe this message of the gospel and embrace it and practice it. So we don't want to do, we don't want to, this is not a template for attacking people. This is not a template for pushing people into belief. It is conversation, an opportunity to show that there's evidence everywhere about God. So, all right, thank you so much. I hope and pray that this study was helpful to you, and I hope and pray that it gives you some insight into the text, and it will be a blessing to you. And if you have any questions, please join us and go to our Facebook page, like it. You can go to facebook.com/HighlandCOC, and you can message us there, or you go to our YouTube channel, or you just go to highlandcoc.net and find ways to call in, and we'll help you with what we can in your journey to God. Thank you so much. Until next time, bye.
Hey, thank you so much for watching our videos and content. If you want more videos, more content, and want to know more about us, visit our website or subscribe to us on YouTube and like us on Facebook. We'll see you next time.